Fine. The sound's not up yet, but I guess it will be in good time. Yeah.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Barbara Kelly from the University of Leeds to give a pre-concert talk ahead of James and Anna's recital this evening. Barbara is a French music expert, but I've been told that she will be talking about the non-French pieces as well. So I'm going to hand over to Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I think it's just about this evening. It's my second time speaking at Leeds Leader. I came a number of years ago to talk about Ravel and a program of French music. Today we're going on a tour of Europe. We're going on a varied tour, taking in Britain, France and Austria. Often they're not put together in quite this way, so it's really interesting. We're doing a bit of time travel as well, from 1861 to 1923. It will give us a fascinating perspective on a very distinctive tradition, many different traditions that are stylistically very different, but share more on a deeper level, such as a preoccupation with love, with loss, nature, both classical and modern literature, and mixing of classical and more popular musical traditions. So please join me on this trip as we go around our number of countries. So we're going to start at home with Roger Quilter. Roger Quilter, who was born in 1877 to 1953. And I'd like to encourage you to have a look at your program. Hopefully you've got a sight of the program notes somewhere, but they're written by George Calloway, who should be here. I'm not sure he's in the room yet, but he is about to arrive. So I will be referring to some of his program notes, and I've tried to complement some of the things that he is saying. So, despite Quilter's German education and training, he captures a quintessentially English sound in his songs. He was tapping into a very highly popular tradition of British song, which, as Valerie Langfield reminds us, was very important in both professional but also amateur music making in Britain. And it's really important to remember that the music that was performed often in people's domestic context as well as in the concert hall needed to be under the fingers, playable, performable, whilst also showing off the particular strengths of the performers. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the repertoire we'll be hearing tonight. Most of the repertoire, there's 7 songs tonight, more than half are Shakespeare, settings of Shakespeare. So the texts are already, in many cases, very familiar to us, and other composers have also set them. So I want to start with Blow, Blow, Thou Winter Wind, from his 3 Shakespeare songs, opus 6, number 3, from 1905, and of course based on the text from As You Like It. There's a wonderful incongruity here between the freezing winter and man's ingratitude on the one hand, and the hey-ho jolly refrain. So the two really are striking contrasts with each other. And I was talking to a colleague and friend of mine that supposedly Charles Dickens referred to this as a streaky bacon approach, that you're mixing things that are completely juxtaposed and somehow don't go together. So please do listen out for that. So if you're feeling the freezing winter, I love the melancholy bits, but maybe that's just me. But also the hey-ho is something we all need in life too. So perhaps my favourite of the songs we'll hear tonight is Fear No More, The Heat of the Sun. I really love that. There's from his opus 23, so a little bit later, 1921, Shakespeare songs. There's a melancholy and eerie quality. It's almost prayer-like, in fact. In fact, I can take that a little bit further. But he deals with nature, life, and love, and death. And actually, we see in the various verses, everything comes to dust. Now, of course, that has a religious connotation to it, and a Lenten tone, which we've, of course, just passed. But Kenway, in his notes, and he must tell me if he arrives in the room, notes that the song switches from the minor, the sort of darker minor, to the major at the very end on the words, "Quiet consummation have," and that lasts until the end. And then we have, under the greenwood tree, perhaps one of the most famous texts from As You Like It, Shakespeare's As You Like It, also part of the 1921 set by Quilter. And he maintains here a persistent light character. So we're not switching between very different and incompatible modes. Now Sleeps the Crimson Petal is a beautiful song from his Opus 3. So he started it in 1897 and it was finished in 1904. So it had quite a long gestation, and it's based on Tennyson. So for the only one that one of two that isn't actually Shakespeare in this book. And supposedly it was an inspiration for GNS's Princess Ida. I hadn't been aware of that, but do listen out. It's a lyrical and tender song, particularly the ending, and the ending reads, "So fold thyself, my dearest thou, and slip into my bosom and be lost in me." Then we have To Daisies, and this is from the set To Julia, 6 lyrics of Robert Herrick, Opus 8 from 1906, so all within a particular period of Quilter's writing. George Kennaway draws attention to Quilter's suggestion of the opening and closing of the flowers. Listen out for the undulating accompaniment, which gives that suggestion. It's all the way through the song. The poet and singer urges the petals not to close before his loved one Julia sleeps. And then we have A Last Year's Rose from 4 songs, Opus 14 from 1910, and the text is by Henley. And often it's seen as about lost love, and of course it's a rose that's beyond its initial bloom. And there's a persistent rhyme in this. I find it almost overemphasized in the particular setting. See what you think. So every 2 lines you have a rhyme with rose, and sometimes actually on every line. So you can't miss it. But I think it does symbolize the fading of love. It's symbolized by the well-beloved rose. So we have our program note writer just coming into the room just now. So I have been referring to you in your absence, George. I hope that's okay. And then finally, O Mistress Mine, again, a very famous text from Twelfth Night. And it's a charming setting, urging us to think about the present loves rather than future uncertainties. So that is the Quilter set that starts and finishes the whole recital, and really quite an important part of the recital. So we're moving across the channel now to a very different sound world. And what's remarkable is that these songs, all written within a sort of similar period, give or take, a couple of generations, do sound quite so different from each other. So Gabriel Fauré was one of the most important composers of French melody, and crucial for its flowering in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Like Quilter, Fauré is known for his smaller forms, notably melody and chamber music. Indeed, apart from Fauré's famous Requiem, there are very few larger scale works. Nonetheless, because you would think, well, maybe how do you build a reputation on small forms? Well, we know that some composers really do manage to do that. But he was a very important figure in his time as a composer, often composing in the summer holidays because he was rather busy with other things. He was an organist and worked most of his career as an organist in some of the biggest churches in Paris. He was a teacher, and then he became the director of the Paris Conservatoire at a very turbulent time of its history, around the time of what's called the Affaire Ravel in 1905. And it's when Ravel was chucked out at the first round of the big Prix de Rome, the big Roman composition prize in Paris. And it was seen as a big scandal. So lots of people got involved. The director resigned, and Fauré was the man who could bring people together. He had that reputation. On his death in 1924, and we celebrate his centenary this year, so there are lots of celebrations all over the world, to commemorate Fauré and to really think about his significance. So he was seen at the time of his death as the most important of what they called a holy trio, holy trinity of composers, Fauré, Debussy, and Ravel, all of whom made very lasting contributions to the melody tradition. And I think today we might not necessarily have Fauré as the head of that trio, of that holy trinity. So something to ponder about. So the first song we're going to hear is Green, from Cinq Mélodies de Venise, and their Verlaine settings. Verlaine settings that are very famous, obviously Verlaine and Debussy set many of them too. So we have Mandoline, En Sourdine, A Climène, and C'est l'Extase. Actually, only the first one was written in Venice, the rest weren't. Robert Orlich, who happened to be my supervisor once upon a time, who's written a lot about Fauré and many of the composers, French composers, he's observed that there are many musical elements that unify all 5 songs. And particularly listen out for the following thirds. And we get it at the very start of Green in the vocal line, but it's really throughout. In a letter to the Princesse de Polignac, Fauré admitted that he was trying, through his set of melody, to create a new form, something new. The pianist and French music expert Roy Howitt has made an important point in his new edition of the Fauré songs, published by Peters recently. Fauré had a sense of how musical tempi should reflect the spoken pace of the words. So that's something to think about, the poem's spoken pace. He writes to Marguerite Bonnier, and I quote, "For Green, I can't overemphasize not to sing slowly. Its pace is lively, passionate, almost out of breath. And then, above all, sing it just for yourself." Now, there's 2 things I want us to think about with this. First of all, the out of breath. There is a breathlessness about in the meaning of the actual songs. But secondly, there is an intimacy in Fauré's songs that are probably unequaled by other composers. There is something that is very interior about them. And we get that, it really is truly chamber music. This is evident in the final stanza of Green, and I'm going to quote this. "Let my head rest against your young breast, still resonating with your last kisses. Let it rest from the sweet tumult, and let me sleep a while, since you rest." Now, one of my colleagues at Leeds, an expert in French literature, has pointed out that this is based on a French sonnet, but it's got 2 lines missing. And the lines that are missing are just before that stanza I've quoted you. And they're a gap in the story. And what we're asked to do is to think about why they're resting. And of course, we don't have to use our imaginations too much to think about what the song is about. But it's interesting that Fauré, there is a restlessness until that moment, but he doesn't make much of the silence of that gap. He doesn't do much musically with that. So that's something, again, to think about when you're listening. Then we have Les Roses d'Ispahan of Opus 39, number 4, which is from 1884. And it's the setting of Le Comte de Lille. I really love the opening piano figure in this song. It forms part of what Kenway calls an inner melody, which overlaps itself in a repetitive pattern, and it's heard throughout. There's something really quite charming, attractive, but you've really got to listen to it. It's in dialogue with the voice, but you have to pay attention. It's not as prominent as the voice. So please listen to the piano. Sometimes with Fauré, a lot of the most interesting music is actually there. Don't tell the singer. Okay. There's a voluptuous quality, though, to this song. It's more outwardly expressive than many of Fauré's songs, and actually has quite a wide range in the vocal line. Howitt comments on Le Comte de Lille's penchant for exoticism that inspired a vein of concentrated beauty and harmonic richness. I think that's a lovely way to put it. Then we have Automne from the Trois Mélodies from Opus 18, 1880. And it's a setting of a minor poet, Armand Sylvestre. He might be a minor poet, but Fauré liked him, and he set him 9 times, but each time in a different group of songs. And I think this is an example, a quite interesting example, of Fauré coming up with collections of songs that aren't always by the same poet. So he's almost creating his own mini anthologies in what he's doing. In fact, Sylvestre also gave us the words for the beautiful Le Secret, the Secret, which is a very, very wonderful song by Fauré. So do think about that. But Sylvester wrote in the margin of his poem that the first 9 lines of this song should be sung. And thanks to Fauré and to our performers tonight, they will indeed be sung. So please look at your program notes for a very good description of the autumnal darkness. And then we have Aurore from the Quatre Mélodies from Opus 39 from 1884, and it's another of Sylvestre's poems. It's got a very attractive melody, and as Kenway observes, we notice that the singer's desires take flight as the morning arrives in the second verse. Perhaps the one I'm most fond of, and I have a personal connection because I sang it from about the age of 16 myself, and it's Le Papillon et la Fleur. It was his Opus 1, number 1, very first composition, and he was only 16 when he wrote it, which is quite impressive. He wrote about it, he says, "My first song was written in the school refectory amid the aromas of cooking, and Saint-Saëns, who was his teacher, was my first interpreter." But critical opinion hasn't always been kind to this song. So Robert Horledge describes as inferior to his other music from this period, and also that it has defective poetry. Now that is quite a serious thing, defective musical prosody, I should say. Roy Howitt comes to its defense. He writes, well, he talks about, Fauré places weak stresses on strong beats. That's the charge, okay. And composers sometimes do that. Ravel often broke rules when he wanted to, quite deliberately. For Howitt, given Fauré's rhythmic play, and there's the use of, I don't know if you know the term, but hemiola, when he's playing with 2 against 3, you get one in the voice and the other in the piano accompaniment. And that the language, the French language, is inherently flexible and fluid, that it's not necessarily a weakness, but he was only 16. It's a playful song that reflects a hopeless but real love between the airborne and free, and probably male, butterfly, and the rooted and trapped female flower. Okay. So we're going to move now to Lily Boulanger. And I first had an interest in her when I was doing my undergraduate dissertation and looked at her unfinished sketches for La Princesse Malène when I was 21, so a long time ago. So I have had a long interest in her. So she was born in 1893 and she died in 1918. She had a very short life. It's important to remember she's the same generation as Millot and Honegger. She was from a French-Russian aristocratic family, and the father was a renowned musician who taught at the Paris Conservatoire. Her sister, Nadia Boulanger, her status could not be more elevated, particularly these days. Her significance as a teacher, a conductor, as well as a composer in her youth. Lily Boulanger was close to Fauré. He acted as a sort of guide to her. While we owe our knowledge of Lily to her sister's tireless advocacy, she was a remarkably gifted composer and the first woman ever to win the prestigious Prix de Rome, the prize that Ravel tried 5 times to win and didn't. Debussy got it, but she got it in 1913. Lily Boulanger suffered from pneumonia and later developed intestinal tuberculosis, dying just 10 days before Debussy at the age of 24 in 1918, in March. So we're going to hear a selection from really quite a long work, Clairières dans le ciel, so clearings in the sky or in the heavens. And it's a setting of Francis Jammes, who was a really contemporary poet. In fact, one of Milhaud's favorite. So Milhaud would rate Gide and Jammes as 2 of his really most important sort of up-and-coming poets. So this was in 1914 that she decided to set the text. And the first is, we're hearing, I think, 4 different excerpts. The first is called She Came Down. And it's less melodic than Fauré, because Fauré really has got a strong sense of melody. And it's more like Debussy in its recitative style, although quite a range, and a bit a greater range in the vocal line, and it sounds more modern. Please note the drop of a 4th at the end of this first one. It was Ravel's hallmark. He ended his, and it was actually in his own natural voice as well when he spoke. Then the second one is If All This, Si Tout Ceci. starts with the Tristan chord, for those of you who are familiar with that. So obviously Wagner's chord that doesn't resolve in the way you would expect. But it's bleaker and it has a more despairing mood. And then we have We Will Love Each Other. It's Debussy-esque in its character and the vocal writing, and it really recalls Pelléas and Mélisande. So do listen out for that, really almost an echo of Pelléas. And then finally, You Looked at Me. It's more hopeful about reciprocated love, however unspoken. Boulanger had a distinctive melodic musical style, even at this young age. There is a mystique around her, though, due to her needing to live a bit apart, even while she was active as a young composer, and also because of her early death. Also, the veneration with which she was regarded by her older sister, who quit composition after her death. She was only 1 year younger than the composers Millot and Honegger, and yet she sounds nothing like them. Certainly, we hear the influence of Fauré and Debussy, but her writing is distinctive and experimental, as befitting the generation of which she was a part. She would have been a very distinctive voice. She still is, though, and her music, thankfully, lives on. So then you have an interval. And we then have some Gustav Mahler. So we really are, it's not often you hear Fauré and Mahler and Lily Boulanger in the same program. So it's a real treat to be able to do so. And the songs are from Das Knabenwunderhorn, so very, very familiar collection of folk poems which were published in 1905 to 1908, which Mahler incorporated into a number of his works between 1887 and 1901, including some of his symphonies. He had a tendency to repeat himself, and there's something quite interesting about that you hear certain elements that are real sort of hallmarks if you're hearing a symphony or you're hearing it in a different context. So just go through some of these briefly for you. We have Summer Changes, the first one. There's a combination here of joviality and also a darker thread running through it. The cuckoo is dead. It will be replaced by the female nightingale. So that's the simple message of that one. And then perhaps my favorite of the Mahler is St. Anthony's Sermon to the Fish. Okay, there's something that's so appealing. St. Anthony preaches to the fish when there's no one to hear him. Okay, and he has a good time, and the fish are quite responsive. The piano accompaniment is wonderful, having more of the musical material and connecting musical thread than the voice, in my opinion, certainly. It's quirky and it's playful. Mahler had a knack of sounding both folky and also very modern. Most of this invention in this song is in the piano, so I urge you to listen out for it. Don't just focus on the words or on the voice. And then the second one is Rhine Legend, and it is all about the ring, of course, the Rhine Legend. Mahler switches register between popular music and classical. Here it is the voice that is more folksy and the piano more classical, at least at the start. The piano takes over the melodic material, and the distinction, it becomes less clear as the song progresses. So that ability to switch register in such a way, I don't know, I was thinking of another composer, and Poulenc came to mind actually, who's got that ability to sound really quite, the ganguette around Paris, and then go into really quite a more elevated, and maybe Tchaikovsky, but this is the subject of another conversation. Okay, so, however, that ability to switch register between folk and classical caused him problems in certain terms of his critical reception, notably in Britain in the early 20th century. There are a lot of really prominent figures who really couldn't stand him and found him in terrible taste, strange from our perspective today. And it's far from how we regard him as a respected and highly original composer today. And then the final song, we return to the cuckoo and the nightingale, and it's playful. Okay, so a really lovely ending to that set. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of Muriel Herbert. Had you heard of Muriel Herbert? Yes? Good. I knew I had a knowledgeable audience. But some people haven't, and that's absolutely fine too. Okay, so She was born in 1897 and she died in 1984. She was from Yorkshire, but she was brought up in Liverpool. Okay, so you can't have it every way. She was a composer, but also a highly accomplished soprano and a pianist. And she wrote over 100 songs, many of which have not been published. Her music was reviewed in the Musical Times. I did a search to see what traces, so the British newspaper online library is very useful, but also searching the Musical Times. But the reviews are often quite patronising, but that's not atypical for attitudes. Very similar things with Germaine Taillefer in her own time, that she's often put into a little box and not taken seriously. However, she fell into obscurity. She won a scholarship to study at the Royal College of Music. The family were poor, particularly after her father's death. And she studied with Charles Stanford and was mentored by Quilter, who helped to get her published. She writes very much in the tradition of Quilter. She has a melodic ease and uses the piano-voice duo to good effect. Her music is perfectly in keeping with the English song tradition, and it's very accomplished and appealing. So James Gilchrist, we'll be hearing from him, and Eilish Tynan and David Owen Norris have done a lot to make this music better known, recording and performing her music alongside her better known contemporaries. And it's absolutely vital that this sort of advocacy happens, and that performers, scholars and concert organisers promote and programme music of forgotten women and other neglected figures. I think it enriches us all to understand music in that wider context and to discover people who, for all sorts of historical reasons, have fallen out of view. So we have Renouncement at the start, published in 1923, and a poem by Alice Mayno. It's a dramatic opening, and Kennaway notes its wonderfully dramatic final two lines. With the first dream that comes with the first sleep, I run, I'm gathered to thy heart. And then this was an interesting find for me. The Lake Isle of Innisfree from 1928. Very famous poem by W.B. Yeats. And it complements the poem well. Yet it brings out the Anglo side of the Anglo-Irish poet. And we don't often hear the Anglo side of that poet. So, you know, I was quite interested and amused to hear that poem in a very inflected in a very particular way. So do listen to that. It's got a very fulsome piano part. And then To Daffodils, a setting by Robert Herrick, and of course Quilter has set Robert Herrick for this concert too, from 1916. It's got a dancing quality, and I was listening to this many times. It's got a café concert sound to it. You might disagree with me, and that's fine. I thought it sounded a bit like a valse dansée, and a bit like Satie. And might be saying something terribly unacceptable, but you know, I do feel that you should listen out for as a quality of that café concert, which, and of course, British composers were fascinated by that culture, and it's not so far away across the channel. So I leave you to ponder that as you hear this charming song. So I hope you've enjoyed your tour around Europe and a little bit of time travel, and I think I've kept to time. So thank you very much. And if you do have any questions and you want to hang around, you're very welcome to ask me. Thank you. So I think technically